Morning, Derek.
Good morning.
Morning, everyone. We will get started in a few minutes, just getting folks in here now. Let me see if I can. There we go.
Hey guys.
Morning, Justin.
Morning.
Okay. The audio video working correctly today. Folks are joining in, so we'll give them another minute or so and kick things off. And a few more folks coming in. Okay, we'll kick it off. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Daniel. I have to give props to my wife for all the decor in the back. She's the one who found the pieces, but appreciate it. Yeah, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar this morning. We are excited to bring Justin and Derek for another great topic. And this is another one of our CE webinars. So we're excited for all the folks who came to get an hour CFP CE credit. Just some housekeeping items. The first half of the webinar will be our presentation, and then the second half will be our Q&A. You will see a Q&A section in the Zoom toolbar here. Please drop all your questions there. You can also view other folks' questions, upvote questions to move them up in our queue, and then we will walk through the questions after the end of the presentations. As well, afterwards, you'll get a survey so you can fill out your first name, last name, your CFP ID. So that way afterwards, we can make sure you get credit for your CFP information as well. So please be on the lookout for that survey. It'll pop up as soon as we end the webinar. Okay, outside of that, Justin, Derek, think we're all here. I will turn it over to you two.
Great, thanks, Markley. Thanks, Derek, and thanks everybody for attending another webinar. So today's topic is it's a little bit different from some of the ones that we've done in the past. So in the past, we've either focused a little more on kind of client-oriented topics or visuals or concepts, or we've talked a little bit more about tools that you might use in your practice when developing retirement income plans for clients. Today's topic is kind of even one step removed from that. We're talking more about risk in retirement and how to think about that and how to visualize it across time, across different types of clients, and so on. And so we'll be introducing some ideas for how to do that today, and then connecting them to dynamic income planning, which is a common topic that we touch on here. So connecting these ways to think about things with the practical side of developing and delivering ongoing dynamic income planning to clients. So helping them understand, when it might be time for an adjustment to their retirement income, either up or down. Okay, so this concept of risk in retirement is actually quite intuitive, and it's exemplified here. The idea is really just that the more you spend, the higher your income, and Income Lab speak. So we think of kind of anything that you are spending on, taxes, lifestyle, baseline expenses, discretionary expenses, and so on. Your retirement income plan, the higher that is, the more risk there is. And by risk, those of you who've been with us before know that we mean the risk that this won't be a sustainable plan and that you'll have to adjust the income down at some point. Typically, that adjustment means a change in portfolio withdrawals. So withdrawing less from a portfolio, though not always, as you'll see some examples here. And that's kind of a crucial part of this generalization of the concept of risk in retirement. There are other risks in retirement, in particular, inflation risk is one we'll talk about, where a change in spending doesn't necessarily change the amount that you withdraw from your portfolio. It might change how much you spend from an incoming pension or something. So the higher my income, the higher my spending, the higher my risk that someday I'll have to tighten my belt, pull it back. And conversely, the lower my income, the lower the spending, the lower the risk that I might have to reduce that spend at some point. And of course, what I didn't show here is there is always a flip side of risk in retirement, which is if I'm taking on lower risk, that also means at some point, what I'm doing is increasing the chances that I will actually feel comfortable at some point in the future raising my spending, raising my income, raising my portfolio withdrawals, raising the amount I spend from incoming cash flows, and so on, and vice versa. So if I'm spending more now, I'm kind of already trying to take advantage of a higher standard of living, and that's going to reduce the chances I'll get to have even higher spending in the future, right? So this is very intuitive. I'm sure everybody understands this trade-off, but it's crucial to the development of retirement income plans for clients, right? Because we want to find a place where both their needs are met and their comfort with this risk, with the risk that their retirement income plan has, kind of are matched ideally, or find the right balance. So we don't want to. It's very easy to reduce risk, almost to zero. Just tell clients to spend nothing, but that obviously is there's a big negative that goes along with that. So it's this balance on the risk return trade-off, which conceptually is very similar to the trade-off in investing, right? We would all love huge investment returns with no volatility on the downside, but of course there is a trade-off. Understanding this risk return trade-off can help us discuss or answer questions like these. So kind of what's the shape of that risk return trade-off? Are there big changes in risk as I change my income, or are they small? Are they always roughly the same trade-off, or are things different depending on the risk level that I'm at? How does this trade-off differ across situations? So, older and younger clients, clients with different, mixes of income sources. How does risk change over time? So as I kind of live through my retirement, as I advance in my retirement income plan, how would risk change? And how do shifts in risk drive income adjustments? So it can be difficult to answer these kinds of questions with the tools that are typically available in the planning world, because often these focus on just giving statistics or visuals on one particular income plan. So one particular spending level, for example. But this is a very narrow way of looking at retirement income and retirement risk, because it just says, okay, maybe this is a plan to spend $10,000 a month. These will be familiar visuals, or you've seen things like this. Okay, we'll run that plan through 1,000 different possible futures, see which ones survive and which ones don't, and give you a probability of success or failure from that. But this gives us information only about a single spending level, only about a single retirement income plan. When you're trying to help clients decide among different spending levels, can I afford a little bit more? Would it be prudent to spend less? Really, we want to understand the range of possibilities. And that could, in theory, be done with these kind of narrow tools, but it would be through lots and lots of guess and check and, yellow pads and manual recording of results. So I want to talk today, and Derek and I have written about this a couple times on Kitsis, this concept of a retirement risk curve, which offers a broader view. It kind of brings front and center the idea that we're helping clients make a choice about spending, about standard of living in retirement, that where there are many possibilities. And really, there's not even a right answer, certainly not a right answer for every client. Rather, just like in investing, we're kind of trying to find that sweet spot for a particular household. So this concept of the retirement risk curve I would think of it as similar to, the efficient frontier in investing. You're kind of saying, hey, across a range of risk levels here, we're going from, 0 to 100, which just think of this as the inverse of probability of success for our purposes today. So a 0 risk level would be 100% probability of success. Of course, this is always estimated risk level, estimated probability of success. No one is ever, guaranteeing things, right? It's within a model, right? So our model of the world, our capital market assumptions, and so on. But what we typically get is a picture like this. So for every risk level, again, risk being the chances that this won't be a sustainable income level, and I'll have to pull back at some point in the future to be prudent and keep risk in line. For every risk level, there's an income. And so we can kind of see that this is the range of possible incomes within this particular analysis for this household. Now, this is a super simplified household with $1 million in a 60-40 portfolio, funding their lifestyle completely through withdrawals. And of course, this is rarely, we rarely find situations that are this simple, but it's a nice kind of, in the laboratory situation to look at. And this kind of thinking about the range of possible income allows us to ask questions like, would these folks be willing to take on 10 points of risk in exchange for 14% more income? So if we look at the difference between the income available at risk level 10, which is 90% probability of success, right? If we're kind of translating to that language, those of you who've been on these webinars before know we really prefer getting away from that kind of language. It tends to psychologically be the wrong messaging, success and failure messaging. So we tend to do the more neutral risk level. But going from 10 to 20 adds 14% more income. Is that worth it for this couple? Obviously, that there's not going to be one answer for every couple or for every household. For some people, certainly yes. Is it worth giving up 10% of the possible income, the possible spending, in order to save 5 points in risk, get 5 points lower risk? That's the difference between 10% risk and 5% risk here, right? So I go from 45,600 down to 40,900 a year. We can see this idea that there's a trade-off here much more clearly by understanding the range of possibilities. So we're not, when understanding this, we're not tempted to kind of gamify this and try to always seek the lowest risk level, no more than in investing we would be, right? We're trying to match, in this case, income and spending with needs and with risk preferences. We'll also see that different situations will have very different risk curves. Now, typically the risk curve looks like what you see on the left here, which is the same curve we just saw before for withdrawals from a 60-40 portfolio. But on another extreme, if a household were depending completely on Social Security, really, this does simplify a bit. It assumes that there really is no risk in Social Security, that Social Security inflation adjustments are exactly matched to this couple's inflation experience, and that the risk that Social Security benefits will ever be reduced is zero. But with those simplifications, it's always the same spending level for these folks, $60,000 a year, right? But crucially, this idea can capture different types of risk. So this is an example that I really like because it shows how it's risk in retirement is not just about portfolio experience, the returns, the sequence of returns that someone might experience. So this is an example of a household with a $60,000 nominal pension. So a pension that's not adjusted for inflation at all. We see at different risk levels, the amount that these folks would spend from that $5,000 a month and the amount that they would save, or I guess these numbers are actually annualized. And that savings in this example would go into a 20/80 portfolio, so 80% bond. So there is some sequence of return risk here, although it initially there's no investment whatsoever. So this is as close as we can get in kind of a realistic situation to isolating inflation risk. So there's very little sequence of returned risk here. There's a high level of sequence of inflation risk. And we can see that, on the extreme, if we were trying to keep inflation risk to zero, so within this model, you're basically looking at the worst possible inflation sequence in the analysis, they would spend only $34,100 from $60,000 in income initially. They would save $25,900 into a portfolio that they would try to grow and then use in the future to make up for accumulated inflation someday. So over time, that amount that they're spending from their nominal check of $60,000 a year, $5,000 a month, would go up. So they'd start spending more and more of it to keep up with inflation. After some point, they would actually be spending all 60,000 of it, and then they would be drawing also from that portfolio that they've been accumulating over time, right? And so here again, we see the exact same idea that these folks would be in a position of asking, what's the trade-off that I'm comfortable with here, right? Could I really feel comfortable spending only $34,000 from a $60,000 check every month, every year? Would I be more comfortable kind of with a coin flip, saying, well, let's spend 46.8 and save the rest? That has a risk of 50 here. Again, no right answer. Would depend on the household's spending needs, what they feel they can actually build a lifestyle with. It would depend on the advisor's evaluation of their situation, their ability to take on risk, right? The possibility that they'd have to reduce income at some point, and so on. But it's the exact same thing. We're dealing with, there's a range of possibilities. We need to figure out, where on this range of possibilities to begin a retirement experience. The other great thing about this concept of risk and risk curves is it can handle complexity as well. So we just looked at portfolio withdrawals alone. We even saw one that was just Social Security, and then we saw one that is only nominal, a nominal pension. But of course, most people have a more complex example. So that's what we're showing here. This shows kind of a mixture of portfolio withdrawals, Social Security, some of it which begins at different points, a nominal single life pension. So also we're dealing with some mortality risk there. A $1,000 a month rental income with projected 3% increases annually. So that may not keep up with inflation in certain situations. On the other hand, in other situations, it might exceed inflation. And the retirement smile. So a plan for changes in spending needs over time. Now this looks really complicated. How are we going to, handle it? And Derek and I have talked before about, how this kind of pretty common situation where Social Security is delayed and there's a mix of different income sources, makes applying kind of basic withdrawal rate based dynamic planning approaches. So adjustment rules, withdrawal rate, guardrails, makes that extremely difficult or basically impossible in a situation like this. So we need something more. And we've talked before about how what we need is again a holistic risk measure, and that's exactly what's being shown with the risk curve. So here is the risk curve for that example I just showed you, and this is now including market risk because they're depending on a $2 million portfolio, inflation risk because they have a nominal pension and a rental income that's not exactly tied to inflation, and mortality risk because that pension is single life, and spending plans changing with age, so the retirement smile. So initially they're taking about $120,000 a year from that $2 million portfolio, but that's going to change over time, or at least that's the plan. And again, we see that we can make the exact same, go through the exact same process of, okay, there's going to be a range of possible incomes, possible spending levels, possible standards of living that this household could have. And we're just going to have to find a level that kind of strikes that balance between, the lifestyle that they would like and the risk that they're willing to take on. So the advantage of this is, again, this broader view of risk return trade-off across, and helping us understand that, there's not one right, probability of success. There's not one right risk level, that clients are able to have different preferences along this spectrum of possible behavior. Also, the advantage of this concept is that it encompasses a broad range of retirement risks. And it's not just about portfolio withdrawal levels. And in fact, trying to distill out only portfolio risk can really be a problem in a situation where there really are lots of other risks that need to be brought into the conversation. This visualization, although, at Income Lab, we are looking at adding this in a very kind of advanced part of our software, it's really more about conceptually understanding this range, so that range of incomes is already available, for example, on Income Lab, by just moving a slider, right? Seeing how income changes as you change risk. So again, this is extremely unlikely to be useful as a visual used in a client engagement. So this is a tool for advisors, or maybe even just a tool for conceptualizing the planning process for advisors. Okay, so let's step away from this concept of how do we choose an income level and balance risk and standard of living, and talk about how we can use these visuals to understand what underlies a robust approach to dynamic planning. So again, Derek and I have written and talked before about how a dynamic planning system that uses holistic risk or total risk guardrails is much more scalable across a client population and across time. So it adjusts very well to changing longevity as people age, to changes in inflation expectations, changes in longevity or in legacy goals, and so on. So I'm now going to go through an example of how one would get to an income adjustment plan. Keep in mind, though, this will include lots of interesting visuals, but only at the very end will we see the visual that a client would see, which is really expressing an income adjustment plan as much as possible in dollar terms, right? Just saying, hey, here's the simple adjustment plan that we have. So just to start out, the concept behind dynamic income planning is really that retirees, at least retirees who are kind of being prudent or have an advisor, they don't fail. They adjust. So people don't adopt a particular spending plan, follow it exactly, come hell or high water, and in a bad situation, run off a cliff, Wile E. Coyote style. The evidence is that that's not what people do. It's probably quite complex, but again, we've talked a lot about how one of the great values that an advisor can provide is advice on when and how to change, when and how to adjust. So that involves ongoing monitoring of a plan, the client's situation, updating, and then in kind of a practical sense, providing adjustment advice, only when it really seems worthwhile. Both administratively, nobody wants to adjust their income or their spending monthly, and also kind of when risk is out of line enough or inflation has accumulated enough that really it's worth a change. Okay, so how would a retirement income plan that is dynamic in this way, that says, hey, we will make adjustments on the upside or the downside whenever it seems prudent to do so, how could that be understood and visualized with these risk curves? Well, let's imagine we have our family with the $1 million 60/40 portfolio, and that they've decided a risk of 20 is reasonable for them. There may be many things that go into that. And it would not just be the understanding of, okay, well, it's 51,900 How do you like that, right? There are other things that we've talked about before to kind of map out what risk could look like for these folks. So it would be, okay, what kind of long-term experiences might you expect adopting this plan, and so on. But we'll focus here just on the what we call the near-term adjustment plan. So let's say that they're targeting an income with a risk of 20. But if risk of their behavior, of that spending behavior, ever goes down enough, they will increase their spending, increase their income. In this case, it would just be increasing their portfolio withdrawals, right? And we've set that guardrail at a risk of 5. So if they're beginning retirement with a risk of 20, we're saying, well, you're comfortable with a risk of 20. If things improve to the point where the risk of spending $51,900 a year from your portfolio, if that ever is down to 5 because of anything that could have reduced your risk, increases in your portfolio balance, a shorter plan because you've lived a while, maybe it's that you actually didn't end up spending that full $51,900 a year, and so your portfolio balance is higher than expected, not because of outsized returns, but you just spent less. For any reason, if the risk of that spending level is down to 5, we're gonna bring it back up. We're gonna bring it back up to 20. That was a risk level you were comfortable with to begin with, so we'll just reset it, right? So 20 already has quite a nice risk buffer, right? It's saying, there's only a 20% chance that this is too high. And so if we ever find that we're being, even more conservative, or, where the risk level is really appreciably lower than where we started out, we'll feel comfortable saying, hey, you could afford to loosen the belt, right? Live a little. And so let's say 10 years later, these folks still had $1 million portfolio. So now there's some complexity with inflation. We'll just ignore it here, but and they're still spending $51,900 from that portfolio. And their plan is now 20 years instead of 30 years. We've talked before about how actually, a plan doesn't decrease 1 year per year lived, but again, we're simplifying. Well, at that point, a risk of 5 is now $53,200. So their current spending of $51,900 is well below 5, right? So they can afford to increase their income, increase their spending, increase their standard of living. And at this point, if they went back to 20, they would be spending $65,300. So what we see here is that just with the passage of time, with 10 years less of a plan, if they had just maintained that portfolio balance, their entire risk curve shifted up, right? What that does is that says, hey, there's a higher income available at every risk level, right? And we hit our lower guardrail here, right? That this basically our current spending was reducing in risk over time. Okay, time to increase. Now, this isn't the right, dynamic increase plan for every client situation, right? It's just an example. Okay, what about on the decrease side, right? This is actually what people will often worry more about, although I think it definitely behooves us to remind people, if risk is down enough, we'll give you good news as well. But let's look at a case where risk goes up. So in this case, we've set a guardrail at a risk of 60. We've said if that spending level, 51,900, ever goes up to 60, we'll reduce our income, we'll reduce our spending, we'll reduce, unfortunately, our standard of living. So in this case, imagine 10 years later, in everything, we're at a 20-year plan and so on, but we have 600,000 instead of $1 million. That in this case would be enough to trigger a change, because we see here that our initial spending of 51,900 on the red line, the entire risk curve, the blue line, has gone down because we have basically less income available at each risk level. And now the income that would be available if we had a risk of 60 would be 51,200, which is lower than our 51,900 that we are spending. So this plan would say it's time to tighten the belt. Now, you could reduce income all the way back to the original target of 20. which would be 39,300. But that's a large adjustment. And what tends to make risk curves go down is, bad stuff, right? So there's been some sequence of returns or some change that was negative. So often clients won't necessarily want to rip off the Band-Aid, so to speak, completely refill their risk buffer and say, yeah, things could be just as bad again, right? We could experience that same bad sequence again. They might do that, but more often they would want to say, well, let's take a small step back and see if things keep getting worse, or maybe they get better. And so I wouldn't have wanted to overreact. In this plan, maybe they would reduce their income, their spending, their standard of living about 25% of the way back to their original target. So they'll go to a risk of 50, which is 48,200. Okay, so just to sum up, an income increase plan, it has a trigger point, right? It says if current spending behavior reaches some risk level, A, which is lower than we started, we're going to increase our income. In this case, increase our withdrawals. And then there's an adjustment part of that plan, which says, and increase it to some risk level. Typically, and as seen in this case, it's just go back to where we started, go back to that risk level. The decrease plan says if my current spending behavior reaches a risk of something else, a higher level than we started with, and actually it really should be a higher than 50 level, right? Because we're saying we want it to be more likely than not that we're currently spending too much. So if we're below 50, we're saying, well, it's still more likely than not that I'm fine. So typically you'd want a trigger point higher than 50, and we're going to adjust in some way. Maybe it's back to our original risk level, but more likely it's, stepping back a little bit and then seeing, we may have several decreases, or it may be that one decrease is enough and we wouldn't want to have overreacted. Okay, so from this, we see that adjustments happen because risk is changing, either because the risk of any particular spending level has gone down. That means the risk curve has gone up, or because of the reverse. Every spending level now has higher risk. The risk curve has gone down. We can actually use that, and I, no one would ever want to do this manually, right? This is one of the nice things about what Income Lab does is we provide all this for you, but you can actually provide a short-term income plan to a client saying, hey, if our portfolio balance changed in such and such a way, we would make an income adjustment, and this would be the income adjustment. So we can provide a dollar-based income plan to clients. And what's going on behind those numbers is we're trying to figure out what would change our risk enough that we would need to change our spending level, both on the upside and downside. And so that's what you see here. The blue line is the beginning point. It turns out if, within the near term, tomorrow, the next year, the next couple of years, we were up to about 1.27 million, call it 1.3 million. This particular situation would go from a risk of 20 to a risk of 5. And so we would our plan would call for an increase in income to get us back to that 20 level. On the other hand, if tomorrow, the next year, the next couple of years, we were at roughly 740,000, the reverse would happen. Our risk would suddenly be at 60, and it would be calling for an adjustment down. This is, a complicated view that is really just showing there's a method behind this. So, this is not the same plan. It's just a more complex example from of a client with Social Security and other income sources. But when you see, okay, what's my proposed income? Well, that is choosing from that range of possible spending levels, that possible range of experiences that we talked about at the very beginning, which is, look, there's some range of spending you could afford. It's just up to finding that balance of, lifestyle versus risk tolerance. And for these folks, it's a little over $14,000 a month, gross of taxes. The income adjustment plan for these folks is very lopsided. This is also somewhat typical because clients tend to be risk averse, and prefer the upside to be closer than the downside. So for these folks, a 5% increase in the near term of their portfolio would lead to an opportunity for an income increase. A 20% reduction in their portfolio would lead to a trigger of an income decrease. So again, these risk curves are really, I'm trying to show how conceptually that range of possible incomes actually is behind the concept of total risk guardrails and an income adjustment plan. But I hope you'll agree, this kind of view where we're talking as much as possible at the right level of abstraction, which typically, if we can, is in dollar terms, is much more understandable to clients and really to everybody, me as well, than the more abstract, risk curve based visuals. But it's important to understand, this isn't a black box. These adjustments are really based on, okay, how does total risk change over time? Okay, so that's the presentation portion of this. Derek, I know you have thought about this quite a bit as well, so I'll open it up to you for your thoughts.
I think just in general, I've had a lot of conversations with client or with advisors lately, where there's been a few different kind of common themes. One, a lot of the stuff we're talking about here, right? That's behind the scenes, right? You're working towards this simple presentation for the client. Kind of some confusion there because some of the writing we've done at kitsis.com has gone really into the weeds of how you do all these different pieces, things that Justin's talking about here today. But ultimately, right, this is what we're trying to get to, but get to advice that is much more kind of accurate and a better fit for the client's actual income in retirement, because it captures what's unique to them. And I think that there's really is this kind of, at least what I've seen, pretty big divide between kind of the withdrawal rate driven framework where, and that's historically what's really been kind of predominantly talked about in terms of guardrail strategies, and this total risk-based perspective, which really does capture all the uniqueness that we see in that spending curve, and really helps bring that to setting appropriate guardrails for a client. And I think there's a little bit of even myself personally, as we're working through this and getting my head around it, kind of a learning curve to go through there as an advisor. But kind of once you see it and get it, there's just so many limitations with withdrawal rate driven approaches that analytically, I think it's absolutely the right direction to go to do that total risk perspective, and can swap out historical analysis, Monte Carlo, regime-based Monte Carlo, use all those different perspectives when it's right, but really with that risk-based framework. So a lot of that detail ultimately never gets communicated to the clients that I'm working with. I'm talking about here's the analysis we did, here's what you can spend. They don't necessarily need to know that, but I'm happy to go in that level of depth if they want to. But for most of my clients, it's just help me understand what I can spend, and really living in kind of the view you're seeing here.
All right, thank you, Derek. Malcolm, it looks like we have some questions in the Q&A in the chat.
Yes, we do. Yep, and I see quick Q&A questions are coming in, so please, if you have any questions, add them to the queue right now. Starting off, question here is, don't you reach a point where increased risk actually buys you nothing and the income would either flatten or possibly go down?
So it does depend somewhat on the particulars of the plan, but typically, this is the typical shape of the risk curve, of the range of the match between income level and risk level. So it's usually kind of at the edges. You see how it's steeper. That's equivalent to, think about the tails of a distribution. So if you mapped out the possible income levels, the top possible, in this case, withdrawal levels, from any kind of simulation analysis, whether that's Monte Carlo, regime-based Monte Carlo, historical, you will typically see, lower and upper tails. The left tail, the low income tail, is typically shorter. And so this is, for the math nerds, this is a log normal distribution. And so what we do see is that at some point, the cost of gaining lower risk becomes quite high. So that's what we see here. If I was trying to go from, a risk of 10 to a risk of 5, I have to give up, almost $5,000 a year. But if I'm trying to go from a risk of 5 to a risk of 1, I'm having to give up, almost $8,000 a year. So there is definitely a point at which an advisor would probably want to say, is this really worth it? Am I kind of, pushing things so far to the point where I'm forcing a reduction in standard of living, just to grab those last couple points of quote unquote safety. So that's definitely happening here. The upper side of this curve is a little less relevant. Most people would never be planning at, a 90 risk equivalent to a 10% chance of success. But you do see that, that right tail, the high income tail, is quite long. So that's why you see such a wider range there. And again, that's basically saying, hey, that the best experience in this entire simulation was allowed extremely high income, right? $140,000 plus. And so, yeah, and the middle section is more or less linear. So as you kind of step up in income, you just kind of gain risk, or as you step down in income, you lose risk, you gain safety in a roughly linear fashion. So I think the areas to really focus on where that is less true are kind of the edges. Now, a lot of people like to live on this left edge, kind of 20 and down or 30 and down, equivalent to 70% success and up. And so I do think the fact that it's not quite linear there is probably relevant. Oh, Derek, do you have thoughts?
No, I'd agree with that. I mean, that's where we definitely see, I lose a lot of confidence when we get into those tails. I tend to focus my planning on that, kind of that middle section where I do think it's going to be much more realistic. And I think for advisors, that's the tendency is to go on the low risk side, so pushing towards the risk of zero, but just understanding that when you do that, there's definitely much greater reduction in income than you see for any other kind of marginal change along that curve.
And then this question is kind of tied to what you all are saying, so I'll give this one out now. Do you have any thoughts around selecting the risk level on the risk curve? Any questions you ask clients to get a feel for their income risk tolerance?
I can jump in on that one in terms of when I'm talking to a client. I often, I'm not a huge fan of a lot of the risk tolerance questionnaires and the way those operate, but in terms of just having a conversation around how important is it for them to maintain their standard of living? How much do they feel like they could cut back if they needed to? And it might just be kind of the subset of clients that I work with, but actually a lot of my clients are in the situation where they actually feel pretty comfortable if they had to cut all the way back to their Social Security income. As we kind of work through that conversation, that's where many of my clients get. And because of that, it helps me reframe the conversation around, you compared to a retiree that might need a more substantial sum from their portfolio to really feel like they have their necessities covered. They could take more risk in retirement if they wanted to, and kind of open up that conversation about, what would they like to do instead? Would it be giving? Would it be doing things with their family? Just kind of what would that look like, and kind of paint a picture. And then through that more qualitative conversation, I definitely get more of a sense of like, okay, this is somebody that absolutely does not want to take a reduction, or this is somebody that feels like they could, and they prioritize spending now versus later. Just all those different qualitative factors kind of help me flesh that out and find the right strategy for my client.
Have you found any connection, Derek, between I don't know, like people who have typically sought, jobs with more of a stable salary versus, I don't know, people in sales or entrepreneurs or things that have kind of typically lived with a little bit more risk in their income in their working years, and that kind of capacity or willingness to make that trade-off in retirement where they say, well, I mean, look, I'm alive now, I'm young now, let's go ahead and spend a bit. I get it. Maybe I'll have to reduce.
Mhm. It's an interesting question. I mean, I anecdotally, I'd say, maybe I've seen a little bit of that, particularly on the, I'm just thinking of some clients I know of in sales, and that maybe have a little bit more of that there, but I don't know, if it's generalizable enough, but I think there's probably something to that in terms of just these different kind of psychographic profiles of retirees and how they think about risk, and how they've thought about risk in their career and their life. And they're used to, somebody who's used to living on a more fluctuating income certainly would be more comfortable with that going down compared to somebody who, has received the same income with a COLA adjustment each year in like a very stable government position or something like that's going to be a very different experience, I think, to think about cutting back significantly. So yeah, I'd say limited experience to really speak to it, but I do think it, I suspect there's something to that.
I do recall hearing about some situations where, people were using this framework to help people make some early retirement decisions, and kind of the probability of success results were not great, right? When you see probability of success in like 60 or 50 or something, you think, okay, well, you can't retire. But by framing it this way as like, well, we can do it, we can hit your spending level, you can retire now. I think in a lot of these cases, they were maybe more on the 40 or 50 range of risk. But then adding to it and here, there are parts of the visualization of dynamic planning that we haven't talked about today. Things like longer term views, right? Hey, what could kind of the landscape you'll be walking through look like, including some of those bad situations, and often, the bad situations in that plan test and dynamically over time were, of course, there were some negatives there, but they were able to say, well, this is the trade-off. Do I want to retire now and just take it? Look, it could be like that. But could I live with it in exchange for retiring now, which is in itself something that these clients wanted. So I do like how this framework makes it clear that there's no one right answer. You don't, okay, when you hit this, then you're fine. It's always this trade-off. So I think, sometimes people, and I think these examples were teachers. So you might think, okay, well, they like stability, but it's also, there's a plus in changing your day-to-day life to more of a retirement stance. So.
Mhm.
This one's a quick one. In Income Lab, when you use the term proposed income, are you referring to portfolio withdrawals or the total income from all sources?
The total income from all sources, yeah. And the example here, although you don't run into it every day, where someone depends entirely on a nominal pension, really highlights why that's important, that it's not just about portfolio withdrawals. And even in the complex situation, I think it's also important. So here, for example, so we see, portfolio withdrawals are quite high in the plan early. They go down, they step down, and then they go down because of the planned the retirement smile. So it's always about, overall, anything that's available to fund my lifestyle, my spending, my taxes, and so on.
And Derek, when you shared earlier, Lisa also shared that a sampling of her clients may not look like yours, that very few of her clients would want to limit income to their Social Security benefit, particularly after the death of one of a couple or one of the members in the couple. And I think, to your point, Justin, the framework kind of fits clients on all across the spectrum of risk, and Income Lab does allow you to factor in, and for those clients who maybe are unlike Derek's clients, really showing them the impact of those portfolio withdrawals and some of those outside cash flows as well.
And I think that's certainly everybody's going to have their unique kind of niche of clients and who they work with and their backgrounds and situation. And so, yeah, it wasn't the intent there that my clients are at all representative of everybody else's experience, but regardless of who you're working with, at least here you have the tools to actually have some of those conversations around the trade-offs and have that discussion.
Perfect. And then next one is when the market is correcting as it is now, when or how often are adjustments to income recommended?
Yeah, it's definitely on everybody's mind right now. I think last month, it depends a lot on when you implemented a plan. That's Income Lab speak for setting a plan to be tracked, updated every month, and to check whether you've hit an income guardrail. So if you started relatively recently, if you checked the box to have that implemented and monitored, you may not have yet seen a reduction, even though obviously markets both on the stock and bond side have been rough lately. Also, the plan would have to be heavy on the portfolio side, but I think we did see a couple of we get aggregated stats on this. A couple plans in this month, May. So we update these plans monthly. We pull in new data where it's available or estimate what direction the portfolios have gone. We step everybody forward 1 month in their plan so that Social Security claiming is closer, they've aged, and so on. So we'll see in June. That cadence is intentional. We feel that it kind of strikes a balance between people wanting to have updates, right? I mean, when things are happening, especially like right now, we kind of don't feel great about a plan that was implemented, a year ago, but hasn't been updated, but also is not kind of updating daily or hourly, which has the potential to whipsaw people. So I guess stay tuned a bit to see what happens in June. How many plans that are currently implemented will trigger a reduction alert for that plan. It would also depend on what the plan was. If somebody had kind of tight guardrails, then it would be more likely. If their guardrails were a little wider because those folks were more comfortable with that, then it might take a little longer.
And this is next one's just a quick follow-up to that one. And then after that, I'll bring JC to ask his question live. The question is, so along those guardrail concepts, when does Income Lab update linked accounts for implemented plans? Is it the first of the month, end of the month, or random Tuesdays?
So we update everything as soon as we have all of our data in, which unfortunately is not the first of the month. It's usually the 5th business day of the month. So we'll call it the June update, but really it's the June 5th. If there are holidays and so on, it can be well past the 5th, weekends and so on.
Just one thing I might add in general on that topic too is that I think advisors should have a plan in place too, and how you want to approach that. Like if you do have multiple clients all triggering an adjustment at the same time, that, in my personal opinion, right, just because I like the monthly update, but that doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to meet with every client that month to talk through the adjustment. Like when you look at over long periods of time and historical sequences and everything that's happening there, whether the adjustments made this month, next month, the following month, it's more that you get that long-term trajectory right rather than you get it this immediate moment. So that is something I've talked to some advisors who feel like, oh, it's going to be too overwhelming to get everything, if everybody gets triggered around the same time. But I think you can be pretty reasonable about how you do that. Just because it's the software is indicating adjustment doesn't mean it absolutely needs to be made immediately.
Yeah, and actually, I do feel like the monthly is a nice balance. But just because we do it monthly does not mean that is, analytically the perfect cadence. In fact, there may be arguments that it should be even a little less frequent. We just do it monthly so that, the plan doesn't get kind of, there's not a long lag between updates.
Thanks. And then JC, I did bring you into the panel. So can you hear us? Oh, we can see you now.
Can y'all hear me?
We can hear you.
Great. Can you bring up the slide that showed the client communication versus the detail showing like the 14,000 and then it goes down to like 13.7, I think, if it goes down by like 6%. There we go. Perfect. So for this slide, I'm looking at the number in red real quick, and I'm thinking about how clients would respond to this. My thought is, in terms of putting the client more in control and actually putting a lot of the behind the scene work that you've done here with the risk stuff, Could you make that 13.4 instead of saying, hey, put the client in control and us more of a guide, saying either A, we can reduce this to 13.4, or B, we can increase your risk, or C, you can start saving more now, so that we keep it sustained at 14.1. Is that how would using Income Lab, how could I facilitate that conversation?
So on the first point, this is something Derek has been beating the drum on, and it is coming. Just the ability to round these. Precision gives the false impression of total accuracy, and so that's a miss on our part. So we will be giving you the option to show these in rounded. There's a little bit of work to do on this, but most likely it'll be rounded to the nearest 100, like as you say. But I think the second part of that is crucial. So that is when a plan hits a guardrail, the household does not necessarily have to continue following the plan. They might say, that $2 million I was going to leave as a legacy, I think maybe we could do 500, or, there are other levers you can pull at that point that would allow them potentially to continue at the same income. It just buys them a little bit of time and so on.
Yeah, it becomes a decision trigger, right? Like when you have, here's 3 things you can do, as opposed to saying you have to do this. So yeah, okay. So I'm glad Derek's beating that war drum as well.
Yeah, it's really, when you hit a guardrail, it's probably time to have a conversation.
Great. Thanks, JC. And then next question here. Let's see. Lisa. So more often, trying to get clients to reduce non-discretionary expenses through housing or mortgage decisions have been tough sells, or to let clients know that discretionary expenses will fall over time. I guess more of a just kind of.
Yeah, I suspect that's true. I don't know, Derek. It sounds like maybe you have a lot of clients whose non-discretionary expenses are low enough that they can absorb that. But what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it definitely does depend on the nature of your clients and their spending and where all that's at. I just happen to have a lot of clients who are very frugal, and I'm usually pushing them to spend more than the other direction. But I do think the understanding the nature of spending, what adjustments are possible, what aren't, having all those conversations going into retirement and understanding where that fits is useful. And there is also functionality within the software in terms of putting in like a floor of spending, right? So you can say, no, I have these crucial expenses. I can't let it dip below that, and then adjust accordingly. So there is some way to build some of that in. If given your clients non-discretionary income or expenses, they need at least a certain level of income, you can build that into the plan.
I know we're about done with time here, but let me share how that's done. So it's kind of just a random example here, but if you go to the advanced settings in a plan, I think this is not often used, but if you go to income settings, you can check, maintain at least your essential income level. So if you've defined that either just explicitly, there's a spot to say what's my essential monthly income, or if you've built a full budget and defined each budget item, how much is discretionary, how much is essential, you can pull that in, and this will set a floor on the monthly income and say, hey, we'll just accept more risk instead of reducing our income below this level. There is a point you can set a trigger that says, well, we'll accept that risk, until our portfolio has reached X. 250, I have no idea if that's a good level to put it at. Depends on where you started and so on. But there is a way to do this. Now, keep in mind, if you say, maintain it and maintain it no matter what, then you're introducing, the opportunity for portfolio to run to zero, which might be fine if there are other income sources, but that's what this would be doing.
Well, guys, thank you again so much, Justin and Derek. Really appreciate all the time and effort you guys put into these webinars. I know our users always give us good feedback after each one. So just want to say thank you, and thank you to everyone who attended and for all your questions. as I mentioned, after I end this, there will be a quick survey to fill out your first name, last name, CFP information. So that way we can make sure that we submit that information to get you your credit for 1 hour of CFP for attending this webinar. Other than that, please stay in the loop for our next upcoming webinars next month, and we will see you all on the next one.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.